then
great.
you're next. Yeah, so
Okay, yeah.
I'll introduce you first.
Yeah, and I'll take over sharing at that stage, shall I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh,
All right. We'll
the recording has started actually. Okay.
We'll let everybody in now.
Shall I silent myself until yeah.
Yeah.
So, Mike, it looks like people are coming in through the lobby, and we've got an audience now. So it's over to you.
Okay. If you could take the slide down. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SuperSolar session in the Supergen Net Zero Conference. I'm Mike Walls. I work in Crest at Loughborough University, and I've been the director of the Supergen SuperSolar Hub and Network since 2012. Today, we want to showcase some of our work, some of the work of the Hub members on exciting new technologies. We want to look at the current status of UK solar, and we're also going to have an update from the on the work of the Solar Commission. But first, I want to spend a few minutes just outlining the objectives of the network, introduce some of the new events that we've got planned, and some of the funding opportunities that are available. And I'll then introduce our speakers. We have 3 speakers, and we'll then have at the end of the 3 talks, we'll have a Q&A session. So please put your questions into the chat box, and we'll go through those at the end of the session. So let me just share my slides. Okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. So, our three speakers today are Professor Henry Snaith, University of Oxford. Henry was he discovered the metal halide perovskite solar absorbers, which has really taken the research community by storm and made tremendous progress. Henry will be followed by Chris Hewitt, and Chris is the Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, and Chris will update us on the current and future prospects for solar in the United Kingdom. And then Professor Alison Walker will provide us with an update on the results of the Solar Commission. So SuperSolar is an inclusive community linking university research industry. We started in 2012. We have over 600 network members. It's led by Loughborough, but the core universities are Bath, Cambridge, Imperial College, Liverpool, Oxford, Sheffield, Southampton, Swansea and Warwick. The hub includes an infrastructure. So at Crest, we have established a UK national photovoltaics cell efficiency measurement facility, which is accredited. It's only one of 9 accredited facilities around the world. We provide training courses. So recently we held a training course for new research students and early careers researchers in PV, which attracted over 400 participants. We have funding for international industrial secondments. We fund conference attendance for early stage researchers also, and we have a small amount of money for mini research projects. We're doing our best to influence business and industry. That's partially why Alison got involved in chairing the Solar Commission, and we produce events of interest to all sectors of the PV community, not just academics, but the industry and the solar installation community. So these are 3 forthcoming events. I mean, we're typically doing about 1 per month at the moment. So next week, actually, we have the 9th Solar Fuels Network Symposium, 2-day event. The invited speakers are Professor Ian McCulloch of Oxford, Libby Gibson from Newcastle University, and James Durrant from Imperial College. So that's a free event, and the details are there. In October, beginning of October, we have the role of solar technologies in sustainable development. We're very grateful to Jess Wade of Imperial College, who's put a lot of effort into organising these. And you can see the list of speakers there. And then in November, and as part of the Institute of Physics events for COP26, we have advances in photovoltaics. The invited speakers there will include Gang Zhong, who is the director of the First Solar Technology Center in California. We also got Sam Stranks, University of Cambridge, Laura Miranda Perez, Oxford Photovoltaics, and Professor Alan Taylor from TWI. So look out for that. And there are maybe another half dozen events in planning at the moment for the rest of this year and the first quarter of next. One thing we'd like to draw your attention to is that we have a childcare fund which is open. So if a female or male member of our network wishes to present or attend one of our events and is constrained by childcare responsibilities, then we can provide some funding to cover those childcare costs. And in the event that, say, an overnight stay is required, we would look at increasing the amount available. In terms of funding opportunities for UK researchers, the International Conference Fund is open. You can make applications at any time. This is really aimed at early stage researchers again. Although obviously international events have been mainly virtual, there are still registration fees to be paid. So please avail yourself of the conference fund. And as things open up, obviously, we will also contribute to travel. And then we have the International Industrial Engagement Fund. This has been very successful. We're encouraging, again, early stage researchers in particular, but also academics, to have extended visits to international laboratories such as NREL or Fraunhofer, etc., or work with an industrial partner. And we will fund up to £20,000 to enable that to happen. And as I say, that's been a very successful part of our offer to the community. So I think it's now time for me to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Henry Snaith. Henry is professor in the physics department at Oxford and became a fellow of the Royal Society in 2015. He was responsible for discovering the potential for organic inorganic metal halide perovskite perovskites for absorbers in solar cells. This is probably the most significant discovery in solar in the last 20 years. On top of that, he's also the founder of Oxford Photovoltaics, who have attracted huge amounts of venture funding. And I believe, and maybe he will confirm this, they're pretty close to launching a high efficiency silicon perovskite tandem. So I look forward to hearing from Henry the progress with that. So I'd like to now pass over to Henry and over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction and for inviting me here. So can I just confirm that you can see my screen, which looks like a PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to talk to you about perovskites, about this sort of very briefly about what they are, present status, and in the research and development. I will show some details about some of our research, and I'm not really sure what the audience is for this meeting, so I apologize if I go a little bit too technical in places, but it'll be a bit of an overview apart from that. So here we go. Let me see if I'm on the right screen. So perovskite, I also still struggle to pronounce it, Mike, so you're all right there. Perovskites, their calcium titanate is perovskite, but any material that adopts this structure is considered a perovskite or of the perovskite family. And the materials that have proven to be very useful and very efficient in solar cells are based on the lead and tin halides. They're not new compounds, first discovered or first reported as early as 1892. But it wasn't until 2009 that they were first implemented as a solar absorber material by a group in Japan, originally led by Tom Miyasaka, where they used them as small quantum dots to absorb sunlight in what were then dye-sensitized solar cells. So we started working on these materials in about 2010 and very rapidly found that we could process thin films of these perovskites. This is just an example of an evaporated perovskite layer on glass, and that just as a thin film absorber material, they could be extremely efficient. And we reported over 10% efficiency in 2012. And since then, the whole community's really pushed the technology and the efficiency of these devices up to beyond 25%, and they're not at their ceiling yet. So they're very close within a short period of time to the absolute record efficiency from silicon, and certainly more efficient than mainstream silicon, or very much close to. In fact, silicon, as most of you or lots of you in the audience will know, is not a stationary target in terms of performance and is still constantly being improved. But if we want to go beyond silicon, or generate or deliver something that's competitive and could actually, in principle, compete in industry with silicon, then we need to do something that's better than it, not just matching it. Matching it will be very hard for a new technology to compete. So we need to try and work out how can we use these perovskites to actually make much more efficient devices, much more efficient technology than silicon. And the answer comes in the tandem concept. This isn't a new concept, but the notion is that the sunlight comes in a range of different colors, which carry different energy of photons. And in fact, instead of just absorbing the sunlight in a single material, silicon absorbs the visible light and the infrared, some of the infrared. And if you absorb it in a single material, there's a fundamental limit to how efficient that solar converter can be. And I won't go into the details. You'll either know it or you don't know it at the moment, but basically about 70% of the energy has to be thrown away primarily as heat or as simply non-absorbed photons in that conversion process. So a perfect solar cell using a single material can only be 30% efficiency at absolute best. And that puts a fundamental limit to how efficient silicon can get on its own. But if we slice this spectrum up into two cells, so one cell absorbing the visible and one absorbing the infrared, that fundamental efficiency limit can be pushed up to 45%. If we go to 3 cells, it could be pushed up to over 50%, and so on and so forth as you get up to more and more junctions. Obviously, there's diminishing returns. Well, not obviously, but there are diminishing returns. And the fundamental limit is somewhere between 60 and 80% efficiency if we had an infinite junction solar cell where we're converting each section or band of the sunlight through a different solar converter. This, as I mentioned, it's not a new technology, and this has been developed a lot in 3.5 semiconductors and specifically for concentrator PV in the past. And the world record efficiency for a solar cell is actually 39.2%. So that under one sun terrestrial sunlight, up to close to 50% under concentrated sunlight. And this is the spectral response in the sort of structure of such a cell. So this shows it's physically possible to make really efficient cells through the multi-junction approach. But the problem is these 3-5 semiconductors have to be almost perfect crystalline thin films to work. And to do that, they have to be grown very slowly. So there is a lot of effort, or significant amount of effort, on improving the growth and trying to make cheaper production methods for these 3-5 semiconductors to make these multi-junction stacks less expensive, but they're still orders of magnitude away, many orders of magnitude away of being suitable for terrestrial PV. Perovskites, on the other hand, can be tuned. We can tune the composition of these materials to actually make the band gap not quite go as low as some of these materials here, but certainly cover most of this spectrum in the infrared to visible, near infrared to visible region, which means they could actually be suitable for tandem or multi-junction cells. And one of the simplest embodiments is to put a perovskite cell on top of a silicon cell, so not to compete with silicon, but to actually augment it in a so-called perovskite on silicon tandem device. And of course, this requires, well, not of course, this requires the perovskite material to absorb about half the sunlight, so it just absorbs the visible light, and then the infrared is transmitted through the perovskite into the silicon. And these cells are maximized efficiency, or the efficiency is maximized when they absorb and generate exactly the same amount of current. Electronically, these cells are in series, and the current in a series circuit obviously has to be the same. So you want to generate the same current in the top cell and the bottom cell. So that means we can tune the composition of the perovskite to get exactly the right band gap, match it with silicon. And the advantage of perovskites, and it's something that makes them almost unique amongst thin film materials, is that you can generate very high voltage, wide band gap from wide band gap materials. And that's what's needed. So here we get up to 1.2 volts or even beyond for the perovskite top cell, whereas you're only getting 0.7 volts addition from the silicon cell. And this ability to generate a high voltage with a wide band gap is what's really enabled perovskites to be very useful in tandem devices. So presently, the world record efficiency set by Oxford PV at the start of this year is 29.5% efficiency. So it's not just efficient on paper, it's actually efficient in practice. But of course, these are small cells, and I'll show you some of the efforts to translate this into actual production performance later on. So just as a sort of aside as to where do we go beyond 2 junctions, well, I've already sort of laid out that we could go up to infinite junctions, but of course we should get 3 working first. And these are just some examples. This is an example from some of our work where this is a cross section of an actual device. The colors are artificial, but these represent these are different absorber layers absorbing with different band gaps. The blue and the high energy photons absorbed in this first cell, the sort of visible to near infrared in this one, and the further into the infrared in the rear one. This is an example of a silicon cell which is textured with pyramids, where there's 2 perovskite cells processed on top. And in terms of absolute efficiency, these triple junction cells haven't delivered very high efficiency yet. It's very difficult to get all the layers processed on top of each other and choose the right layers, but there's been very little effort in this. In terms of open circuit voltages, they generate very high open circuit voltages, but the efficiencies still need to be optimized. The potential is for delivering, up towards 40% efficiency from these sort of triple junction, and then maybe we'll go to 4 junctions after that, or maybe we'll come up with some other concepts for increasing the efficiency. But there's lots of scope going forward from where we are today to significantly increase the efficiency. So what I'm going to present now, and this is where I apologize for a little bit of technical details, is what are the key challenges for perovskites, but specifically for tandems. As we go wider, as we widen the band gap of the semiconductor, so we absorb more and more high energy photons, there becomes more and more of a challenge of not having defects in that material and actually generating high voltage. So one of the key challenges can be considered, how do we generate a very high voltage from wider band gap perovskites and materials? And the other challenge, which is the case for any technology any PV technology that's new is how do we maximize the long-term stability to ensure that it's competitive with silicon. So I'm going to actually well, I won't skip this part. I'll go to this slide here just to emphasize that where do we have losses in a solar cell? This is an energy diagram that represents a solar cell. If you're not used to looking at these sort of things, I apologize. This is the valence band of the perovskite absorber or the absorber. This is the conduction band. These charges, as we shine light, they populate, the electrons get promoted from the valence band to the conduction band. And it's that separation of charge that generates voltage in the solar cell. In fact, I will go back. Sorry, apologize for my voltage in the solar cell. And we call that quasi-Fermi level splitting. And I'll come back to this term shortly. In a perfect solar cell, the extraction layer or contact will only allow one charge carrier type to move, in this case electrons from the conduction band. It would reflect holes, and there'd be no voltage loss or no energetic drop between the quasi-Fermi level in the absorber layer and the contact material, and likewise on the whole contact. But in a real system, or at least in any system, this electron can also recombine back with the hole that it left. That recombination or relaxation of an electron from the conduction band back to the valence band is the opposite process of light absorption, and it results in the emission of a photon. So that is a recombination process in any semiconductor, and that has to happen. There's a reciprocity between absorption and emission, and any material that's a strong absorber will also be a strong emitter. So actually a perfect solar cell, if there's no losses in the material, it has 100% efficiency of re-emission of light when you're not extracting it. When you connect it to an external circuit and the current flows, then you extract the charge, so they can't recombine. But when you're leaving it under what we call open circuit conditions and not extracting it, it's 100% efficient at re-emitting light. So that's a perfect solar cell. In reality, we have defects in the materials. The electrons can drop into traps or defects, and then they recombine without the emission of light or with lower energy photons. And that we actually consider a non-radiative recombination, and they are losses. In addition to recombination and losses within the absorber layer, when we put interface materials on, we need to put electrodes on, we need to put charge extraction layers on. In fact, we can have further surface recombination or losses at the interface. So what we have to do when we develop these materials is try to minimize the defects in the bulk of the semiconductor and try to minimize these interface or surface recombinations. So I'm showing you here a plot of open circuit voltage against band gap for a range of different solar cells from literature. And what we generally find is as you increase the band gap, there's more and more difficulty in increasing the open circuit voltage. There's a few examples where surprise results have been achieved, but generally it's hard to push the open circuit voltage up. Current density is more easy to obtain, and these lines show what you'd expect. I think this is 90% of the fundamental limit, and this is 100% of the fundamental limit. So current density is very, very good, but open circuit voltage is challenging, especially when we go to the wider band gaps we need for tandem cells. Once more, most of this data comes when is originating when an organic ion called methylammonium is used in the perovskite absorber. But this methylammonium ion is actually very unstable. It's thermally unstable, and if we substitute it for formamidinium, we get much higher stability. But if we show this data of the open circuit voltage for cells without methylammonium, it becomes even more challenging to get high voltages as we go to wider band gaps. So there's something still not understood. It's likely to be due to some passivation effect of the methylammonium or methylamine, but there's more of a challenge of getting high voltage with methylammonium-free devices. So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm realizing I'm probably getting too technical now. One thing we discovered a year or so ago was that we could add certain ionic salts. There's additives we can put into this perovskite material, and they can have a positive impact. This is an example of a piperidinium salt that when put into this composition of perovskite gives an increase in voltage. Very importantly, it gives quite a significant increase in long-term stability. These are cells measured. SPO stands for steady state power output. So cells measured under 60 degrees, non-encapsulated under light, sunlight, and the sort of lifetimes is getting up to many thousands of hours for the best cells. What we want to understand is, why does it improve the stability, and why does it also improve the open circuit voltage? And I'll just show a couple of slides here where what I'm showing is the photoluminescence quantum yield of the perovskite absorber. And I mentioned that a perfect solar cell would be 100% emissive. So these are still less than 1% emissive. So they're not perfect by a long way, but this is actually quite good for a solar absorber material. And then from this luminescence efficiency, from understanding the physics and the thermodynamics of what governs the properties of these materials, we can calculate the quasi-Fermi level splitting, which is analogous to voltage in a solar cell. And what we find is these materials should deliver a voltage of about 1.35 volts. In fact, that increases a bit compared when we add these ionic additives. If we look at when we put the different contact materials on, we find this voltage is reduced. So we're getting more losses at the interface between the perovskite and the hole conductor, and C60 is the electron conductor here. We're also getting losses there. Notably, with the additive added, these losses are reduced. So these devices should give a 1.3 volts open circuit voltage. In reality, they improve, but they don't deliver 1.3 volts. They deliver about 1.2, 1.22 volts. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but we can quantify these losses. And I hope I haven't sent everyone to sleep. But what we find is that there's basically an extra loss, the difference between the voltage we think we should have from the radiative, from measuring the luminescence, and the voltage we actually get in the cell. And this indicates that there's also a step in voltage at the contacts. So I'm not going to go into any more detail, but basically we see losses at the interface. So I'm going to, I'll just present this one slide here. This will be the last technical slide, so you can take a breather after this. Will we ever be able to get really high voltage from wide bandgap perovskites? And in fact, we can look to another technology, light emitting diodes, to see whether this will be possible. And this is an example of some recent work we've done using perovskite nanocrystals as the light emission layer and light emitting diode. And here we can get an external radiative efficiency up to 20%. Now, this is not a structure that would work very well as a solar cell, but it indicates that these materials, when interfaced with semiconductors that are similar to charge extraction layers in the solar cells, they can deliver very high radiative efficiency. And just as an example, if our solar cell had a 20% radiative efficiency with the band gap we need for perovskite on silicon, then we'd have a 1.38 volt VOC from that wide bandgap perovskite cell, not just 1.2 volts. And in fact, that would lead to a 34 to 35% efficient tandem cell. So this is the roadmap, really. How do we get this high radiative efficiency to get, not just 29 and 30% efficiency, but actually get up towards 35% efficiency? I was going to present some more on crystallization and stability, but you'll be happy to know that I'm not going to. Based on time, and I'll just spend just the last 30 seconds or a minute just giving you a sort of status of Oxford photovoltaics. So as Mike mentioned, I founded this company from the work in our university group, and it's basically got an R&D center in Oxford. I'm working on taking the perovskite technology to a stage where it's efficient enough and stable enough and suitable for manufacturing, and then transfers that technology across to a Brandenburg facility that's owned by the company that it acquired in 2016, where we're presently building, well, there is a pilot production line. It's been there for a few years, and presently building full-scale production line. So just as some sort of timelines of improvements, the tandem cell technologies from 2014 onwards have now got up to 29.5% from the work in Yarnton in Oxfordshire. And the work in Brandenburg is basically translating this onto full-size wafers and then making them production ready. So my timer's just gone, so I should probably, oh, sorry, got to try and switch that off. Sorry, shouldn't have set it if I didn't know how to stop it. There we go. Last two minutes, well, less than that. The notion is to take these cells and put them into modules and then develop the modularization. This is an actual perovskite on silicon module coming out of the laminator in Brandenburg. And these are some examples. Of course, it's all well and good making efficient cells. Making efficient modules is more challenging, but when we make efficient modules, or we have efficient modules, they have to last. They have to last 25 years. That's the warranty. And these are just some examples of some of the IEC tests that these cells and modules have been going through in the company. And of course, they've got to entirely pass the IEC and multiply fold, really, to have some confidence that they're going to last the duration. And this is just a little timeline of the company's progress. And as Mike said, and I'm really hope it does happen, next year in 2022, we are very likely to have real product coming off the Brandenburg line. This is a 100 megawatt line that's being built and commissioned at the moment as we speak. But that is really just the start. 100 megawatt isn't a drop in the ocean for photovoltaics, and really the exciting time will be seeing this technology scale up to the multiple gigawatts and maybe even terawatts over the next 10 to 20 years, because that's what we need to do to combat climate change. So with that, I haven't got time to show you the video of cells being loaded, but oh, it's going, there you go. And I'll just thank my research group and obviously Oxford Photovoltaics, and thank you for your time.
Hey, thanks, Henry. That's fantastic work, and thanks for the update. And we do have questions in the chat, and we'll come back to those later if you can stick around with us.
Yep, I'm just going to try and stop sharing.
So next up we have Chris Hewitt. Chris is the Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, which is the solar trade association in the UK. He's got 230 members across the industry. Chris is a member of the SuperSolar Advisory Board, and his team have taken a keen interest in bringing his members and university researchers together to identify real problems. Chris is overseeing right now a boom in solar installations, and he's actively involved in influencing policy at government level. So I'll hand over to Chris.
Mike, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. And yeah, we'll have quite a change of gear, really. I think hopefully we can sort of segue from the last few slides of Henry's presentation there, which was obviously all about how we get this to scale into the industry. Fascinating developments in perovskite, really exciting. And then I'll tell you what I think is what we see ahead for the next decade, really, in the UK solar industry. So that's what I'll take you through. So I'll give you a little bit of a state of current play, where we think our role fits in terms of meeting those net zero challenges over the next 10 years and then towards that 2050 target. I'll run you through some of our scenarios. We've just recently produced a report looking at sort of the scenarios for growth for the industry over the next 10 years in the UK as we see it, and what policy changes we might need to see to help that happen. And so that will hopefully bring us through the sort of 20 minutes or so. In terms of the state of play, we are, I would say this, wouldn't I? A major success story of the renewable sector in the UK. There's now 14 gigawatts of capacity in the UK, and we've moved through the subsidy phase, and we're now delivering subsidy-free solar at a competitive rate compared to other technologies. The technology is cheap, it's effective, it's very easy to deploy, it's very flexible to deploy at different scales. I think that's one of the key reasons that solar is going to be a major part of net zero across the world. And we're going to see that grow and grow. So our analysis for the next decade is that without any policy change whatsoever, we think that we'll probably double the capacity of solar in the UK between now and 2030. With the correct policy support, we think we can treble that. That's a quick graph of the current sort of deployment of solar in the UK at the moment. So we've got around about 14 gigawatts of solar in the country. The yellow chunk there is solar parks. There's around over 1,000 solar parks in the country. The two blue bars there are residential solar in dark and commercial solar, rooftop solar in light blue. We see all of those sectors growing over the next decade. And what's interesting is that that last little uptick that you see in that graph, that's post subsidy. So that sort of demonstrates that the cost effectiveness is really coming in. That's a snapshot of what has been deployed over the last 2 years. So 730 megawatts has been built solar in the last 12 months. That's 125% more than the previous year. Granted, some of that previous year does include the first lockdown, which did impact the industry, but actually we bounced back from that impact of the pandemic pretty quickly. Roughly 2/3 is utility scale solar parks, and roughly sort of 1/3 is rooftop. As I said, we've now deployed in the UK 1.3 gigawatts of completely subsidy-free deployment. The reason is the economics. So those two graphs, one is a Bayes graph, the one on the left there is showing what their estimates, what government estimates of cost of electricity generation across different technologies, showing that large-scale solar is actually likely to be the cheapest technology for generating electricity, cheaper than onshore wind, cheaper than offshore wind, certainly cheaper than fossil fuels. On the right-hand side is our estimates of the decline in commercial rooftop costs. And again, that's been coming down year on year steadily and continues to decrease. Just running through what we see coming up. The utility scale pipeline in the UK has grown hugely. It now stands at 19 gigawatts of potential projects being developed in the UK. Not all of them will be built. Some of them won't get planning permission. Some of them won't get a grid connection, for example, but 4 gigawatts of those do have planning permission, do have a connection agreement in place, and are just ready to be built. Another 4 gigawatts is already through the planning system. And a new trend we're seeing in the UK is a significant but small number of very large solar park projects. So there's one 350 megawatt project which has received planning permission in Kent. Another 3 or 4 now in the system being developed, similar sort of size of multiples of 3-figure megawatt projects. So what do we see in terms of the scale of the challenge? So the reason we picked the 40 gigawatts target is because that's what's in the Climate Change Committee analysis around carbon budgets for what is required of solar to keep the country in pace with that net zero target by 2050. We think that's entirely possible. It means that we're going to be installing something like 3 gigawatts a year between now and 2035, and that certainly has been done in the past. We think that can be done again. And it's not just us who are saying that now, so pretty much the entire energy industry is now behind sort of a threefold target for 2030, which is 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, 40 gigawatts of solar, and 30 gigawatts of onshore wind. Those are the sort of the numbers which, as I say, the whole energy industry is really behind, and has been articulating that to government over the last few months. Also, a number of other sort of NGO stakeholders, sort of environmental organisations, who are again promoting that as the sort of the baseline that we need to get to in terms of targets for 2030. As I said, we've done some scenario analysis to look at how we get there, what's required to keep us on that path. And you can see that the full report is free on our website, so I'd recommend you look at that. But I'll run you through some of the findings now. We looked at sort of 4 scenarios, if you like, sort of business as usual scenario, which is effectively no extra policy change between now and 2030. A sort of a low ambition where there was some superficial policy changes, ratcheting all the way up to that sort of net zero compliant, if you like, scenario, which would require some not dramatic but significant policy changes, we would argue. So that's where we see the industry going. The red line at the bottom there is where we think we can go without any policy support, and obviously we need to bend that line to the green one and 40 gigawatts by 2030. I think that's just really repeating what I said in terms of those other targets. The one to pick out there is energy storage as well. So I think as well as the sort of the wind and solar generation, we do need to see an increase in energy storage, both utility scale, sort of grid scale batteries. either co-located on solar and wind or standalone, but also in factories, in homes, that sort of battery storage to enable to manage that flexibility of a more renewable system. Entirely possible. I would say that there probably are, again, a similar number of pipeline of energy storage projects coming through as well. So that's again a technology which is really developing fast. Again, we probably see that roughly 2/3 is going to be utility scale projects, but we do see growth as well in the residential and the commercial scale technologies over the next decade. As well as the obvious climate benefits, there's also economic benefits. So we think that if we reach that 40 gigawatts, there'll be another 13,000 jobs at least, an extra 17 billion of economic sort of activity that would go along with that. And because when solar and wind, in fact, come onto the system, they generally displace fossil fuels, so it's gas that is turned down to enable that renewables onto the system. There's actually quite a big carbon benefit in terms of displacing that fossil fuel electricity generation, which we still have and will have for the next decade on our system. A lesser known benefit is that on solar parks particularly, the land management is starting to yield biodiversity benefits as well. So we're starting to see anecdotally, and we're going to be working with the teams of ecologists to do surveys across the country on this. We're seeing increases in wildflowers, increase in pollinators, there's better protection of hedgerows and flood alleviation in some places. Lots of opportunities for nature recovery through the use of solar parks as well. So that's something which I think is going to be an increasingly important benefit over the next few years. We've got a whole task force looking at that. And if you're looking at integration with agriculture, again, you'll see dual use. So you'll often see grazing alongside or within the solar park, as well as potentially some other sort of more specialist crops, particularly in Europe, being developed. What do we need to do to make that acceleration happen? Briefly sort of splitting through into sort of the three subsectors really. There's the solar parks, the utility scale, which we see is hopefully growing to something like 25 megawatts by the end of the decade. What we need to see to make that happen is consistent contracts for different auctions, ideally annually, so that those technologies can bid in for price certainty. This is not a subsidy, because those prices that were bid in will almost certainly be undercutting the wholesale price, but they will be guaranteed for a number of years, and so that stimulates investment. There's a few tweaks, I won't go into the details, but there's a few tweaks around the planning regulations, which could certainly increase the amount of capacity of solar which we use, which we can get onto the land, which has received planning permission. There's a reform around network charging, which is required to make sure that we have the grid in the right place, and that those costs of the grid are properly and fairly distributed, and business rates needs some reform as well. As well as the policy drivers, we're also seeing the market itself on utility scale really picking up. So we're seeing corporate public sector power purchase agreements, quite sizable ones. So we're seeing the City of London and Warrington have signed agreements to basically buy the power from new utility scale solar parks, completely subsidy-free parks across the country. Companies like Tesco, Amazon, Budweiser, Anglian Water, Transport for London, all engaging in this market, and that's growing. On the commercial scale, sort of the large rooftops, again, this is probably an area where I think there's quite a lot of capacity for increase here, because it's been sort of lesser known, I think, in the UK market than perhaps the rest of Europe, and it's something which we're seeing that growth happen already in the UK, and we think that will continue to grow. The sort of policies that could help, again, around planning regulations, particularly for the new build, large buildings, commercial scale buildings. You could make sure those regulations are increased in line with net zero to ensure that solar is installed on those buildings. There's tweaks to business rates. Again, the business rates really is not treating those companies who have solar on the roof in a fair way, particularly when you compare to other on-site generation like gas-fired CHP, where there's an exemption. Solar is not. There's things you can do with capital allowances, and on the public sector, post-COVID, we did have a public sector decarbonisation scheme which helped public buildings decarbonise, whether it was energy efficiency or on-site generation or heat pumps. That's been very successful. We'd like to see that rolled out for the rest of the decade. And on the public sector, sort of land and buildings, and the sort of examples that we're seeing coming through, the MOD has already 3 or 4 pilot schemes on its land. They are, if they work out, they're talking about 80 solar parks on their land over the next 7 years. Not a huge landowner in the UK. We're seeing disused landfill sites, old landfill sites, starting to have solar put on them as well. Prisons, schools, hospitals, court buildings, all starting to see more developments of solar. And I mentioned the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund earlier. The other development we're seeing is car parking and integration with EV charging. So we're starting to see, on say park and ride schemes, solar parks being put, if you like, over the top of those car parks, which helps to then charge, so produce the electricity for electricity charging points. On the residential side, again, we see that tripling of capacity is absolutely deliverable. What will drive that is twofold, really. One is changes to planning regulations and changes to building regs. So we think that the current pipeline for building regulations, which are already in place, means that the majority of English homes, new homes in England, will require solar by 2023. We'd obviously like to see that extended throughout the decade. We would like to see still some sort of grant support, particularly for social housing, to enable them to green those buildings, either through local authorities or some revision of the Green Homes Grant sort of scheme, which failed earlier, but no, really due to no fault of the industry. It was a poorly designed scheme from the government side. What we see in the residential sector is increasingly we're going to see an integration of different on-site technologies. So it might be insulation, it might be EV charging, it might be your solar panels, it might be solar thermal, it might be a heat pump. I think that retrofitting industry is going to start to integrate, and they're all going to start. Our installers certainly install quite a lot of these technologies together now, and it's that sort of that integration piece which is going to be really, really important. The other big driver, I think, particularly for consumer, is the integration between solar and electric vehicles. So we're already seeing the first solar powered EV forecourt. Only EVs can come and recharge at this place. There's no petrol at all, and it's completely solar powered by rooftop solar, but also by PPAs. And we'll see supermarket car parks, we'll see workplaces starting to introduce this as well, I think, and we'll see increasingly residents as well. When you're putting solar on, you might be thinking of buying an electric vehicle, you might be thinking of electrifying your heat. The more electric capacity and more electricity consumption you have, if you like, the better value that it is to have it from an on-site generation like solar. So I think that ability to charge your own vehicle at home, I think, will be a really, really attractive concept. And finally, this is, as we've just heard from Henry, is this is still a young technology. So we're seeing thin film being developed and will come into the marketplace this year. We will see solar on cars at some point. It may not happen in Britain first, but I'm sure that will happen. We'll see more integrated roofing products, agri-PV, various floating solar projects already happening. The City of London Airport is going to have a floating solar project very soon. And I've heard discussion about offshore solar as well, but that's some way off. But I think don't be surprised to hear some innovations which you really hadn't thought of come from solar the next decade. So really, that's my message: is this is a very successful, fast-moving industry. It's clean, affordable, easy to deploy, very flexible. There will be economic benefits, and I actually personally think that 40 gigawatts is likely to be achieved, if you like, almost without government policy in the end. But we certainly do need that support in the short term. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Fantastic talk. It's fascinating to see the way that solar is going in the UK. And I mean, there are many people who think that the resource in the UK is not sufficiently large enough, but the proof is in the pudding, and we're seeing fantastic take up even without subsidy. So that's great. There are you've got a number of questions in the chat. Maybe take a look at them and stick around, please, and we'll answer them later. So now I want to hand over to Professor Alison Walker. And if you just go out to your slides, Chris. Alison is Professor of Physics in the Physics Department at the University of Bath. She's a theoretician and has made many important contributions in organic and perovskite solar cells. She chaired the Solar Commission, which issued a report on the opportunities in solar in a launch at the House of Lords in 2019. And I think she's going to go through some of the recommendations. Over to you, Alison.
You're muted, Alison.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to present the Solar Commission. It was a result of my talking to William Burns at the UK Energy Research Council in 2018, and we realized that solar at that time was a bit of an unsung story in the UK. And so we secured funding from UK ERC to employ consultants, Regen, to look at solar in the round. So as Mike said, my day job is doing advanced modeling, trying to understand Henry's and other people's perovskite cells and also organic cells. But I direct a training network for postgraduates in solar. That's the New and Sustainable Photovoltaics Center for Doctoral Training. I also direct a training network, Maestro, which is covers the whole of the EC. And the EC had also picked up on this, that solar is popular with the public, but they don't really know just how much activity surrounds solar. So there's some overlap necessarily with what Chris has presented, but it's in a single report, which can be downloaded. It's not a particularly big report. It's not going to take you hours to download. I've given the address on my website, and it's very compact. And I think that has the advantage if you want an introduction to solar in the UK, where it's been, where it is, and where it's heading. And it was interesting because the European Commission also picked up on these policy aspects, and about a month or two ago, I sat on one of their policy panels talking about where solar is going in the EU. So the politicians are realizing that there's really something to be gained. It's not just a few solar cells. The view was, well, silicon, it works. What more do you need? But there's this huge kind of infrastructure for solar, which Reagan, to their great Regen, picked up on. The work, as Mike said, the Commission report was presented in 2019 in the House of Lords, and I'd be very keen for it to be picked up through what Chris Hewitt was saying, through what Henry is doing, picked up by the public so that they can see that there's jobs in there, there's exports, and there's a lot of fun, dare I say, to be had in this topic. So I'll move on to the next slide. And the Solar Commission aim, first of all, what are we? And we are a unique, thank you, Chris, for putting it in the link in the website. What we are was a bespoke partnership of leading academics, system operators, and industry. And it's a kind of policy document in that our aim was to examine where the UK could use its scientific and technical capabilities to play a leading role in the innovation and industrial strategy opportunities. And particularly because the rise of solar as an important way of mitigating climate change. And it is quite unique, and full credit to Regen, who had the necessary contacts. So what I want to show you is how all these expertise was brought together to show you that there's a thriving industry, which Chris has alluded to. So who were we? Well, I won't spend too long on this slide, but just to show you, You'll see a couple of names there that you'll recognise. Henry and Mike were both on the commission, as was Neil Greenham, who gave a very beautiful summary of the Solar Commission at the House of Lords event when I was in South Africa. And we had Phil Dale from Luxembourg and Neil Robertson from Edinburgh. So we covered a lot of bases already with the academic side, but the important thing was the industrial involvement. We have these Paul Warren and Katie Tan are members of our industrial advisory panel in our Centre for Doctoral Training, and they contributed a lot to the report, as did the National Biljana from the National Grid, Robin Lucas from Open Energy. These are firms exploiting solar in the UK, and which are, again, somewhat unsung. And I think it's how everyone is working together. These small firms, Siemens are involved, not just small firms. There you've got the financial experts, in particular Sonia Bedford, who are also very interested in solar. On the government side, there's William Burns, who was really very much a co-conspirator on producing this document. And we had colleagues of his, Louise Jones, Chris Koenig, and Richard Dobson. So I'm just going to tell you what they said. So this is, I think you should be able to see it more easily. I see it rather small form. This is a very telling graph, which is in the report. And it shows you how we started from essentially zero solar uptake in 2010. So what happened in 2010 was a feed-in tariff. And this is a fantastic example of how a government initiative can really get the ball rolling. And it did in spades, because the timing was amazing, because just a few years later, the price of solar dropped thanks to the Chinese efforts, who realized how to make silicon solar cells much cheaper. Now, this is interesting in the present context with the semiconductor chip shortages, because the original solar cells were just leftovers from making the chips for computers. And now we're kind of almost come back to square one, where the silicon chips they're being, not literally fought over, but they're very scarce. But fortunately, solar doesn't need those silicon chips anymore. It makes its own modules, and the price is now insanely. The solar power has been referred to as insanely cheap, which I think is a very nice quote from Martin Green, who is the person who's really promoted solar. So anyway, so that happened, and solar power took off. So even as the feed-in tariffs plummeted, it didn't matter, because solar power was a serious player in the UK. And the next slide, you can see how it's it flattened out a little bit as feed-in tariffs dropped, but now it's taking off again because of the importance of climate change. So the applications of solar PV, Chris has already commented on, so I'll just do this fairly briefly. But what I want to stress is that solar isn't just about solar farms. There's and roof-mounted panels. You've also got retrofitting, which is being done by Viridian Solar. You've got an active building center, which was developed because the idea is that you should include all the renewable technologies and integrate them into a single building. And this is based on the fact that digital technology is progressing. So I'll come onto that now. So the topics are the cell technologies. I'll mention that briefly because Henry's covered that in the case of perovskite cells. The storage systems, because everyone said, well, solar doesn't work at night, so you've got to have an effective coupling to these storage systems. What's really enabled the coupling and the exploitation of solar is the digitalization, which I'll talk about, and by the way, is generating vast numbers of jobs. Asset management on the financial side, Regen had very good contacts in these areas, asset management and the green finance. And there's, again, many jobs in finance and huge interest in finance, depending on solar. So it's a single topic, but it's a single umbrella over a very wide range of activities. So cell technologies is a picture of perovskite cells from Oxford Photovoltaics, which Henry described. And so the Solar Commission was aimed at making recommendations for future policies. Where should the UK go? And we argue that there should be sustained funding for fundamental research, but the materials research, because the perovskites didn't come from nowhere. They came because we got this huge effort in materials research in the UK. We need focused research on novel PV devices, and who knows what's going to come beyond the perovskites. But the important thing, as Henry has shown with the Oxford PV and has been shown by many others, it's got to be industry-led development for new applications, so that the research is actually taken up. It becomes sustainable in that the funding from its exploitation can generate money for further research. We like to see collaborative research within the UK to maximize its international competitiveness. I mean, I really can speak about that with long experience of running EU projects. UK isn't an island on its own. There's the US, there's China, there's the EU, and we're not going to progress by ignoring efforts elsewhere. But equally, if we lose the expertise in this country, we won't be able to take advantage of progress in other countries. We want to develop the next generation of photovoltaics researchers. Well, I've just come from Sheffield, where we had our showcase, and the Centre for Doctoral Training has been training around 60 postgraduate students across 7 universities in the UK in all branches of solar technology. So that includes the perovskites, it includes silicon, it includes thin film cells. And we're aiming to teach these kids, I mean, they want jobs, and they're finding jobs in the commitment, in the industrial engagement with solar. So there's, for example, there's the innovation in solar panel design. We need to look at that. We need the commitment from industry to keep this ball rolling. And we also need the government to create market pull. So coming on to storage systems, because I can't think how many times I've been told that as I say, solar just, why bother with solar when it doesn't work at night? The storage systems are coming up in how successful they are thanks to the government funding. There's some very large installations, such as the one I've shown here with a Tesla battery, which is like 3 megawatt hours, which is quite a serious amount of storage. There's a solar farm where it's been demonstrated how solar can be directly linked to energy storage. And the point here is that nowadays we can cope with the solar intermittency by linking very carefully, very directly with the storage. So really the link comes from digitalization. So business models used to be based on centralized generation and supplies. Digitalization allows much more decentralized approaches, thanks to digitalization. So that encourages new companies. So a constant refrain, which Chris also alluded to, but as we were trying to get across here, jobs, jobs, jobs in many different areas. And these new companies are generating a lot of jobs, as I see our successful postgraduates from the CDT picking them up. You've got to have efficient integration across the renewable energy generation, which also Chris mentioned. You've got smart power to ensure that the generation is done efficiently, so you're not throwing away solar when it happens to be a bit too hot. You're able to integrate it with other sources of power to have a constant sources. And the National Grid have been instrumental in developing these techniques. You need the regulatory support, which is where the government, UK government, comes in and has already, through very imaginative initiatives taken by the government, is creating opportunities there. And also there's opportunities for the established power electronics companies. And one example that the Regen picked up on in our report is the development and design of inverters, which convert solar power to AC, alternating current power, for the grid. So asset management is something that Mike is I know is very much involved with, and that again is another industry which depends on solar. More jobs again, and it uses artificial intelligence. So we're getting all these skills and all this expertise in artificial intelligence, and you can use it here in a really in an area where it mitigates, to mitigate climate change. And it's simply, solar cannot be used without adequate artificial intelligence. And one way that comes in is through using data which is collected by drones and analyzing that data to ensure that the cells don't just sit there and get covered with dust, etc. And the other thing is that solar cells have a habit of degrading, but if you can pick out which solar cells have gone, then you can realign your electronics to avoid those. So that gives the whole modules, the whole collection of the panels, a much longer lifetime. You can use this link with batteries I've already mentioned, and you can use battery-powered robots. So robotics is another area which is thriving in the UK and can be brought into the service of solar. UK really, its expertise in solar is widely recognised. I really can tell you this from the Commission's sort of warm embrace of our efforts with the UK training, with the European training networks. And the Chinese are very, and the Americans, they're hugely enthusiastic collaborators. So we shouldn't underestimate how much the UK can export. Talking of exports, we had Pilkington, NSG Pilkington, Nippon Steel Glass. They are massive exporters of coated glass. And the coated glass are a fundamental part of the solar cells that are made. Green finance, I found this fascinating, even though it's way outside my comfort zone in terms of expertise. But there's a lot of money. So the interesting point here was that you've got to have this large reallocation of capital to get to really allow renewable to play its role to mitigate climate change. And so we've gone from $93 trillion. So we need $93 trillion in green infrastructure investment to meet the global climate change, which is not a small sum. Looking more locally at the UK, we need 1% of our GDP to meet the UK's 5th carbon budget. So that is also locally a not insignificant sum. But having said that, say it generates jobs as well. And so there's a lot been initially where only a mere 140 billion was invested globally. But now we're heading towards 4 trillion by 2050. So again, just look at how it's expanding. There's open markets in transmission and distribution, which the financial people are very intrigued by Mike. Am I running out of time? I've almost finished anyway.
You've still got a couple of minutes, Alison.
Oh, that's fine. That's all I need. Good. You've got, you've also, but again, this is a burgeoning industry, and we need integrated behavior to allow the financial experts, the UK is very well known, to be able to do its bit for renewable energy. So I'm on to my conclusions, and this is so this was the conclusion of the Solar Commission, which is that the key areas of innovation in solar PV are closely linked. And so it's not just the solar cells, it is the whole systems approach that needs to be interlinked. These links exist informally, but it would help to have them formalized more. The government and industry should work together. That recognizes the massive role that solar PV is playing in this smart decentralized energy system. It's just part of a bigger whole. That it invests the UK's existing capabilities, which are huge, to play a key role across the value chain, to secure the business investment, again capitalizing on the enormous existing activity, and to coordinate investment in innovation. So there, I would just like to acknowledge William, who really set the ball rolling, Rachel Hayes at Regen, who did this amazing report, and the members of the Solar Commission. And thank you for listening. So I'm going to unshare my.
Yes, thanks, Alison.
Yeah.
Yeah. So solar not only is a key ingredient for net zero, but it also has huge commercial opportunities, and we should be taking advantage of them. Yeah. So if you want to come out of your,
I'm just coming. I can't. So
should be a button at the bottom. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it's at the bottom.
Yeah.
Hang on. At the bottom.
Little cross.
Yes, I'm looking for the little cross, and I can't. I just see the share button, where I should be. I'll stop presenting. There we go.
Okay.
That's it. Good.
Great, thank you. So what I suggest, and I hope everybody agrees, we'll extend the session from 2:15 to 2:20, just to give us time to deal with some of the questions that have appeared in the chat. So the first question came from Amuta Joshi. It's quite a long one, so I will précis it. It's aimed at Henry, and basically saying, could you comment, Henry, on the stability of perovskites in both straight perovskite cells and in tandems? And he's got another question which is related, asking about the life cycle assessment and the possibility of recycling.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Amruta. So this, I mean, the stability of perovskites, there isn't one answer to that. It obviously depends on who's made them, where they've been made, and what they're being used for. But certainly, you know, the stability of the perovskite technology being developed by Oxford PV is expected to match the requirements for terrestrial deployment. So that's, you know, warranted product for 20 years, matching the degradation trajectory of silicon. So it's at a level that it's very substantial, and you know, all the indications are that product will be product worthy and be able to match that. Of course, unlike silicon, there hasn't been decades of experience with this specific material. There haven't been perovskite modules in the field for 5 to 10 years. So there is still some risk and some uncertainty there. In terms of learning from silicon and what's been done, or the industry in general, of course, there is a lot of learning. We're working with a number of, when I say we, Oxford PV is working with a number of companies that have got decades of experience in enhancing the stability of existing PV. And of course, anyone in the industry knows that stability isn't a fixed variable for the existing technologies either. It's constantly being improved. But basically, the policy is to implement the best in class lamination techniques. Glass laminates are going to be used rather than the Tedlar back sheets. These are polymer back sheets that do let more moisture in than glass is entirely impermeable. You know, standard things like how does a junction box last for 25 years? These are things that have been predominantly solved in the industry. There's still selections that you can make that are more or less stable, but all those other components that are part of the module, part of the balance of systems, there's been a lot of learning, and they're where failures can happen. And our task as technology driver is to make the cell technology no longer the limiting factor. And that's what the target is for the first products to be deployed. The cell itself, the perovskite layers and cell architectures will not be limiting the stability. It will be the standard issues that are present across any PV technology.
Thanks, Henry. Got one more from Laurie Peter, who says, how important is surface recombination at grain boundaries in polycrystalline perovskite layers?
Okay, so surface and grain boundary recombination. Yeah, they're not distinguished. So basically, there's recombination in the perovskite materials. It is at the surface. That's where we have to use passivation techniques to passivate those defects. So you can make a perovskite layer with very little effort, as you know, and get a 10% efficient cell. But if you want to get a 20 or beyond 20% efficiency, you have to take care to worry about passivation. So it's something that has to be done as it's done in any PV technology. One of the interesting things with perovskite is you can have parts of the material completely degrade, and it has very little negative impact on the rest of the material. They do seem very tolerant to regions degrading and the performance still being sustained. So it's not that you get killed by defects, but certainly to get to the peak performance we need to compete with silicon, deliver a more efficient product, we have to control that. And that's partly through the growth and crystallization of the material, and it's also through passivation and additives. And some of that's understood, lots of it is not understood still.
Thanks, Henry. I'll give you a rest for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
There's a question for Chris, I think. Is hydrogen also of interest to the solar community for storage?
Actually, yeah, I think there was a second question that featured hydrogen as well, I think later on in the chat there. So hydrogen's a real buzzword at the moment. And I think, yeah, clearly the government have gone for a hybrid blue and green hydrogen strategy, which I think is a mistake. Blue hydrogen is basically fossil fuel technology, and there should be no government money going to support that. It's a complete blind alley as far as climate change is concerned. There is interest in, there are a number of pilot projects looking at doing solar to hydrogen in the UK. I think you'll probably see that developed more quickly in other parts of the country, other parts of the world where there is the solar resource is larger. You'll see wind and solar feeding into hydrogen, I think, in the medium term. So but in terms of storage, it's actually battery storage, which is the most important thing in terms of enabling that flexible system, which Alison was talked about. I mean, pretty much every single solar park that's looked at now will consider batteries as co-location as an option. It's pretty much standard practice. They'll either be putting it in straight away, or they'll be saying in 5 years' time we're likely to have a battery here. That's just everyone does that now. It's quite sort of common practice. So, and you'll also see those asset owners and those financiers having portfolios of wind, of storage, and of solar, and so you'll see that sort of flexibility in finance as well.
Okay, another question from Laurie. How optimistic are you that current government will follow anything other than business as usual?
I think some of the policies that we're advocating they will pursue. I'd say on building regulations that they're already going down the track that we're recommending actually. So it's not all bad news, but actually I think this particular government is actually just behind the curve and is out of touch with what's actually happening in the energy industry. So they have their own particular winners that they're picking based on prejudice more than what's actually happening in the market and the science that's out there. So I think that's the disappointing thing to me. I think we'll probably deliver that 40 gigawatts regardless of government policy. I think we'll get there faster if we have the right policies.
Thanks, Chris. Question for Alison, again from Laurie. The UK, unlike the EU, is proposing a strong input from the blue rather than the green hydrogen. How do you see solar contributing to the green hydrogen in the UK?
Well, I see it increasingly coming up in the research funding, but the question is whether there'll be investment. I mean, it's a good question. I think it's doable because hydrogen is just a form of storage, but it only makes sense if it's green hydrogen, as Chris was just saying. So all we can do is produce the documents that Chris has done and that we've done in our with the Solar Commission to point out to the government that it simply can't pick winners. It's got to see us as a whole, and hydrogen plays a role in that whole, as using renewable energy to produce the hydrogen. Using fossil fuel is just a dead end. But I can't tell you what the government's going to do. I'm not sure government can tell you what the government is going to do.
It does seem crazy to convert gas into hydrogen, I have to say, especially without carbon capture. But anyway, I think that we'll have to end there. We're at 2:20. I want to thank Henry, Alison and Chris for great talks. I think we've had a very good session. I also want to thank all of the people who attended this meeting. And just to remind you that at 3 o'clock, we have another session starting on policy implications of Supergen research ahead of COP26. So please rejoin us at 3 o'clock. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you, Mike.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Mike. Yes.
Thanks,
and
Alison.
Henry and Chris.